Hello, everyone. It's Doug Rogers. It's November 3rd.
This is Russell Rogers. We're the Rogers team with Keller Williams Southlake. Let's talk DFW real estate. So, Doug, we've been talking, and we get this question pretty much constantly, right? And I think you've even had it as soon as yesterday. But what is happening with the market, and where are we going?
Let's just start with kind of a fun story. I met this young man yesterday. He's in the computer programming business. Sharp young man. And he asked me, so, well, should I buy now or should I wait? I said, well, that's the $24 question, because everybody asks that question. Should we wait? And then we start talking a little bit about his situation. He's more a young person, single, never bought a house before. He's going to be in the FHA price point, and he's going to be using FHA financing, or conventional financing. But either way, he's going to be at the minimum down payment of 3.5 to 5%. So I thought, okay, well, let's take this afternoon and talk about what would happen if you bought a house today. What would the payment be? And what would that same house rent for if you just chose not to purchase the house? And what would it rent for? And would you be paying rent at one number and your principal, interest, taxes, insurance, your total payment if you bought the house?
Yeah, so I think it'll be fun. We're basically going to argue both sides of the argument, but together. So we're not going to be against each other, but we're both going to take the affirmative and then we're both going to take the negative and go through all the points. And I think the main idea here is this is the conversation you should be having or should have had with your realtor. And if you didn't, I think you missed a step and they missed a step and did you a disservice. So I think it proves that we kind of go farther into this than most people. And hopefully we can do that with you as well in the future. So Doug, do you want to kick us off on why buying now might be a good idea?
Well, here's the way I approached it. I have a rental property in Louisville. It's worth $350,000. I have the taxes to the nth degree. I pay the taxes. I know the insurance cost. And so I use 7.5% as today's FHA rate. And so with the mortgage insurance premium, the taxes, the insurance, the principal and interest all rolled in together, it's $3,200 a month. So on the positive side, you're going to own the house. About $280 a month are going to go off the principal each month. So you're making around $3,000 a year by your loan balance going down. Secondly, if that house goes up 3% in value each year, and that's if, because there's no guarantee of when anything's going up, it could go down. But if it were to go up 3% a year, which is average or below average what we've seen over the last 5 years, you'd be gaining another $10,000 to $12,000. If you had the ability to write off the interest, because many people don't have enough deductions to actually use the interest write-off. They use the standard deduction. But if you could write it off, there's another $4,800 in interest you could write off. So if that were the case, then you're in good shape. But we have to compare it against something. What does that house rent for? Well, I own the house, and I know what it rents for. It rents for $2,000 a month. So you could be in that house renting it for $2,000 a month, or you could own the house for $3,200 a month. So in a perfect world, you're going to need the 3% increase each year to justify paying that additional amount. You're going to need to write off the interest, and you're going to need that loan balance to go down to break even. Now, your hope is you're buying at the bottom of the market, but Russell, are you really buying at the bottom of the market, or are you buying at the top of the market?
Yeah, and that's the answer none of us will have. And this is the part that kind of makes me the maddest, the whole, marry the house, date the rate conversation that doesn't continue from there because we don't know because there's too many variables. I think in the local area, and we'll talk about it now, I think in the local area in the long term, or at least the intermediate term, not 1 or 2 years from now, because you really shouldn't buy a house for that time frame in mind. But for the 5, 7, 10, 12, 15, 20 years from now, home prices will continue to rise. Now, from what basis we go from there is the question, but there's a lot of evidence to kind of show it's likely that will continue. And we'll kind of talk about that now. So I did a simple just correlation analysis on government spending and home prices for just the nation in total. And I got a 95% correlation. But basically, as you can see, as federal spending has increased dramatically since I did the calculation from 1963, which is how long back the median home price had been calculated according to the Fed. And you can see how as government spending increased dramatically over that time period, so did home prices. So not to get political with the questions, but anyone really looking at this objectively would think that government spending has a dramatic impact on asset prices and specifically home prices. And we've talked about this before, but home values or owning a home can be a hedge against government inflation. We've seen that even recently with COVID. So if that continues, which you can answer that question yourself, but if government spending continued to increase as it has over my entire lifetime, then that could be a support for home prices. And then another thing was also the population increases in the DFW area. The U.S. Census put out some information that in 2021 to 2022, so in that year, the DFW gained 170,000 people, and just Fort Worth gained 20,000. Now, saying it out loud, you may take it one of two ways. That may sound like a lot or not that many, but imagine how much housing has to be created for 170,000 people to move here in 1 year. DFW is a very large place geographically, and there's a lot of cities, but the large builders can't produce that many homes that quickly. We were talking before the show, even the large ones like maybe D.R. Horton, and it depends on the situation, of course, but to do like 30 homes in a month would be a huge development. So imagine how many D.R. Hortons it takes at 30 homes a month to make up for 170,000. Now that's people, not families, and also you have multifamily coming in for apartments and things, but there's two supports for the prices to go up.
Well, I'll tell you another anecdotal story. I just got back from California, and you ask yourself, everybody hears the story. The Californians are moving to Arizona, they're moving to Florida, they're moving to Tennessee, and they're moving to Texas in droves. And I'm out there just looking around and making a few observations. Obviously, the gasoline prices were all $6 and more. Here, they're $2.80 to $3. But everything you buy out there is expensive. It's still, I try to buy a sandwich is $20. If you go to the deli and you get a bag of chips and a sandwich with a soft drink, it's $20. Everything is expensive. And the chances of that environment changing, of the political environment there in San Francisco and LA, the downturn they've taken with homelessness and the non-prosecution of shoplifting and the things that are creating problems there, I don't think it's going to change. And if it's not going to change, the people are still going to be moving to a lower tax state, which Texas has no income tax. We have higher property taxes, but when you combine those two things, people are still going to move here. But Russell, here's a question for you. What would happen if everything gets rosy, the economy heals up, inflation goes down, and all of a sudden the Fed starts easing rates and mortgage rates drop from 7.5 to 7.25 down to 5.5? What would happen to home prices?
Home prices would go up tremendously. I obviously can't give you a number, but the monthly payment is what everybody qualifies on. It's what people harp in on. I don't think that's the way to do it, but that's kind of how everything functions. And especially since you have to qualify for a monthly payment with your ratios. And so as the function of interest rate times the price, right, the amount of debt you have to buy that house, the more debt you can have, the higher the prices go. And so as interest rates come down, you can afford more and more house, and people will usually stretch, even though they don't take the guidance from our last video. But home prices will increase. So if the economy, especially the local economy, which you can speak to historically, if the economy has any level of just, kind of standard output, not a recession or depression, if we just kind of have normal from here, home prices can continue, especially in a interest rate decreasing environment. But what have you seen the last times whenever we have like 2008 or different, maybe 2012, when the national economy wasn't doing as well? What did it look like locally?
Dallas-Fort Worth always does better than the rest of the nation whenever there's a housing decline. And it's really interesting, and there's some multiple reasons for it. Number one is we're in the central time zone. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but if a company has an office in LA, an office in New York, an office in Florida, an office in Texas, and they're going to reduce staff, they typically keep the staff in Dallas-Fort Worth because they're in the center of the country, and they can make a phone call to New York and phone call to LA still during the working hour. So if you have an East Coast, West Coast bias, for some reason, the center of the country does better. Secondly, it's a low expense for office space. Our office space is probably 50 cents on the dollar for what other big cities experience. I had one more major automobile company, actually move several hundred people here from the Detroit area and left the building vacant for over a year. And they said it's cheaper to build a new building and leave the office vacant and pay the rent for a vacant property. We were getting such a discount by moving. We can still move and pay the rent on a vacant building. So between the cheap rent, low taxes, central time zone, whenever the country struggles elsewhere and they're closing offices, they don't close them in Dallas. They don't close them in Fort Worth. We're in a really great location. And our other secret weapon is DFW Airport, one of the largest airports in the country. Again, it's in the center of the country. So if you're an executive and you need to constantly fly somewhere and you're in charge of deciding where we're going to live, they tend to choose the Dallas-Fort Worth area because they can fly to New York and they fly to LA. They're halfway there. So our marketplace is sturdier. We will go down, but we won't go down as much as everyone else. And sometimes we don't go down at all.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we're looking at here too. We've gone down a little bit recently. And my point again, the last several episodes is if you're buying now for all these reasons we're discussing, I would really look for a deal. Now it's going to depend on the area. Like we've already said, in the really kind of high demand areas, you're not going to be able to go snag a deal. But if you're in some of those areas like Alliance or outside of kind of the major economic areas, if you can snag that deal and get 10, 15, 20,000 plus off, you're already down, right? Those sellers got desperate, and even if houses stayed the same from here, you're still kind of up 20,000 in that example. So if you can kind of snag a deal, you're already kind of buffering yourself against any kind of price decrease. And in the future, you'd be able to either refinance easier or not have that same high monthly payment because you got seller concessions maybe for a rate buy down or something to that effect. And so you can kind of weather that storm if it were to happen more easily. And so I think that would be the strategy depending on what area you're looking. And this doesn't all mean that buying now is the right time. It's obviously going to be dependent on you and your specific situation, but let's talk about the negative sides as well, right? So let's talk about when sometimes weren't maybe the right time to buy and then why, and then how we look for it here. So, I think the people that bought last summer in the kind of the end of the mania, and I talked to a lot of people about this, like that really was not the time to buy. Things were really jumping after they'd already jumped so much and interest rates had already been increasing. I think you even had an example where you only had one offer, but they went like 20,000 above. Was it something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so that agent didn't realize that we were slowing down, and I don't know what the conversations were had, but that they went 20,000 above a property they could have got for list price.
That's correct. And each market's different, so you have to approach each market differently and understand the value at that location. But going back to our conversation, what are the negatives to buying now? Well, everything I explained a few minutes ago said, well, if the values go up 3.5% or 3% a year, then it could be worth buying now. Well, what if they don't go up 3%? What if you're in a marketplace, especially on the outskirts of town, where they go down 3% next year? Now you're upside down, and let's hammer this conversation home. If you're putting 3% down or 5% down, you better be darn certain the market's going up, because if it goes down 5%, between the mortgage insurance premium that's added back on FHA or your reserves, you're upside down. And now you're going to have to bring money to the table if you're forced to sell that house. If you lose your job, or you go through a divorce, or there's an illness in the family and you have to sell right away, there is nothing more painful than to have a conversation where your house that you bought for $350 is now worth $325, and your loan balance is $345, and there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% in expenses or a repair to sell the house. Now you've got all that, and that's when foreclosures take place. So sure, it's a great time to buy if market is going 3 or 4% up every year. You've got very little risk. You've got a great job. You've got some reserves. Fine. But if it's going the other direction, if you're putting very little down, less than 5% or less than 10%, you better have reserves, and you better be darn certain the market's heading in the right direction.
Yeah, and to my earlier point too, you really have to be thinking in the long term. So if that's going to be the house you're going to be living in for 10 to 15 years, and the monthly payment makes sense, and you have reserves, and you've planned ahead like we talked last week about increases in insurance and taxes, if this is a 15, 20-year house for you and everything makes sense for it now, then you can kind of look, because the future it's likely to increase at least at some point, or catch up, 10 to 15 years out in the case of a recession or prices going down, right? So things will work out in the long run, most likely, or at least historically it's shown that. But if you're only in this for like 5 years and you're barely able to make that payment now, and you're only putting 3 to 5% down, you need to really think about it, like Doug just said, because I can't imagine it's fun to sell your house, and you have to, when you're selling it, you have to then pay other people, and you end up with a negative instead of some equity at the end.
Yeah, we did that in 2009, 2010, where we'd go to the closing table and the seller would be bringing a cashier's check of 10, 15, 20, even $30,000 to get out from under a house. Had that same experience back in the early 90s. And it's a sad situation, and you think it's never going to end, and then when it finally does, it's really painful. But it goes back again. You better have reserves. If market's not going up, then you better be right. And here's an interesting story about how you can be right. It's quality. If you buy a house under these circumstances, always buy quality, a quality location, a quality house, a house that's in good shape. You can't have any red flags. You can't back up to something. You can't back up to a power line, or don't back up to Taco Bell or Walmart. The house can't have a kitchen that's too small or a master closet that's too small, or it can't have any negatives. As long as you buy quality, you're going to be protected in the long run.
Yeah, and we've talked about this. Those Cape Cod style houses in the Heritage there at Alliance, that's one we talked about, where in the hot markets they sell just fine, but if things do slow down, they can kind of tend to take a little longer, maybe have some problems because it's just not a typical home style here. So I really like them. I like the way they look and everything, but to your point, even that, I mean, even in perfect condition, even the style of it can be a little off and cause problems down the road.
Yeah. Anything outside the norm is always the first thing to slow down. Condos and townhomes slow down faster than your standard single story, 4-bedroom, 2-bath. Anything that's out of the norm. Now let's go to a bigger house. If you're a house that's in the part of town where they're selling in that $7 to $1 million range, it better have a study. It better have a second bedroom downstairs. Should have a game room, and even better, a media room and a 3-car garage. And it better have room for a pool if it doesn't have one already. Because if it doesn't have those pieces of the puzzle, then it's going to be hard to sell.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that group of people you were talking about. You don't have a lot of reserves. You don't have a large down payment. You can't really buy what you want at this time, or maybe if you did, it would be a real reach for you. Let's talk about what that looks like game planning going forward, because I think that might be helpful. So if you can't do the game plan for what you have now, let's talk about what you can game plan for. Because to your earlier point, that rent versus buying a house, I mean, these are numbers we ran on, like Doug said, our own rental properties right now. So yours was like $1,200 difference, and that's what about mine was as well, about $1,200. So if you save $1,200 renting instead of buying for just 1 year, I mean, you're looking at like $14,000. So why not just wait and save that money? Actually save it, right? Not blow it on cars and fancy stuff at Christmas or whatever the case is. Let's save that for a year. You got a new question to ask yourself at the end of the year, which is, now am I ready? Do I have everything Doug just said? You can even improve your credit during that time. Make sure those credit cards are paid down and all those things. Get yourself ready. And then you don't have the responsibility of appliances breaking, roof issues, or anything like that. You don't have any weird housing costs coming at you, and you're going to be much more secure. But those are some of the reasons not to buy now. Did you have any more?
Well, you could add in, if you were saving $1,200 a month, now let's see what we do with that. First of all, let's pay off debt, high credit card debt. Get rid of it first. Secondly, can we get rid of the car payments? Thirdly, do you have any black marks on your credit score? I mean, let's be honest, there's a lot of folks who over time either missed a payment here or there, or they ran out and didn't pay a phone bill or something, and their credit score is 645 or 640, 620. If you'll make amends, pay off those negatives, and start paying everything on time, that 650 will turn into a 700. Now, if you've saved that 14,000 and it goes 3 years, let's say you go 3 years saving 14,000 a year, you've now moved from the guy who's putting 5% down to the guy who's putting 20% down. And what that does is it gets you a better interest rate, a lower principal, and if you really boil that all, you're saying on a $350,000 house, you're saving $750 a month on the same loan, regardless of whether it's at 5% or 7%. Doesn't matter. You're going to save about $700 because of the size of the down payment. And there's things that, if you've never bought a house before, it's called mortgage insurance or a mortgage insurance premium, that when you're putting less than 20% down, that gets added back to the interest rate. So when they tell you the interest rate is 7.25%, well, it's really 7.25% plus this little interest rate premium, where you might as well be paying 7.5%. Because that's what it equates to as as they add that back on, and it's added back on to the loan on FHA, and it's added as a premium on your payment in the conventional market. So you can do things that's going to make you money going forward. And if I told you just be disciplined and wait 2 or 3 years, you could save up to $700 or $800 a month. That's great. Now let's flip it around. The longer you wait, if the market is going up 2 or 3% a year, then you're going to have to pay a little bit more for the house. But again, it goes back to, are you disciplined, and do you have reserves, and can you weather the storm and buy today?
Yeah, and that's also if you're concerned about prices going down. And we're kind of leaving this very strange time, right? I think we all remember this little thing called COVID and all the crazy things that happened with the housing prices, toilet paper, you name it, right? And so we're kind of still in that cycle. We haven't really normalized, so to speak. And so even with the Fed raising rates this fast, which I believe is the fastest of all time, the fastest in the shortest period of time, at least, maybe not the most percentage, but it's the fastest in the short period of time ever. And we're going to end this here. If you do rent for a year or 2 or 3, this is going to be in the rearview mirror, and you're going to know a lot more at that point. And so maybe it didn't go your way because prices still continue to go up, but at least at that point, you'd be much more sure of your decision and have a much more, you'd have a much better understanding of the playing field at that point versus what we have now, which we're still leaving the mania in some ways. And now we have these high interest rates, and the prices haven't really been affected like I thought they were, and like a lot of people thought they were.
All right. Well, just to put a couple of things in context, let me run down right quick what's happening in the marketplace. And, I take for granted that you understand what I'm talking about when I say, well, the Flower Mound, Capel, Highland Village added 4 listings. So there's 23 new listings in the last week. Active option, 16 houses went under contract this past week. And in that marketplace, there's 218 listings. Well, what people don't understand is that number of 23 new listings this last week should be 50. And the number of total listings of 213 should be closer to 500 or 600. That's how few houses there are on the market right now. You compare that to Frisco, there are 682 total listings there. That shrunk by 13 over the week before. They had 89 new listings and 58 went under contract. And both of those are good numbers heading in the right direction. The Alliance Corridor has a total of 449 listings. That number should be closer to 800. I mean, it could even be 1,000 based on the size of that marketplace. It's a really, really large marketplace. And there was 46 new listings, which is 8 fewer than the week before. That number should be going up, not down, so far as new listings. And only 18 went under contract this past week. That's a tiny number. When you consider there was 446 houses to choose from, only 18 went under contract in the past 7 days. That's a tiny number. Now, the Grapevine, Colleyville, Keller, Southlake area, there's 23 new listings. That's down 10. There was 33 the week before. And the under contract in the last week added 20. That's the same as the week before. Total listings there, 331. That's pretty much holding the same. But in those 4 marketplaces, there's a lot fewer listings than there should be. So if the interest rates were to pop and heads really south, I think we'd see more listings coming on the market and people being able to move and more people buying. The pot would be stirred a little bit more, but currently it's kind of a quiet, slow-moving market.
Yeah, it's strange, and I know we've talked about this before, but like especially the Alliance area, that number of total available listings continues to grow, but it's still so low. So I think that kind of points to that 7% issue or that affordability issue, because if we had that few and people were really wanting to buy, the number would be decreasing. But I think we started like in the upper 3s, and now we're at almost 450. So, it's just, it keeps getting bigger and bigger every week because homes are sitting. And so I think it shows, again, that kind of dual market where hotter areas are still pretty solid, but the outlying areas are going slower. But that's also what you got to look at. And it's a very strange time, to my point, that a year from now, we're going to know a lot more than we do right now about what's going to happen, obviously, right?
Well, here's one more point to just study for this week. There's been a nice drop in interest rates. What are the current rate? What's the rate today? Yeah,
so per our episode last week, we got up to 8% last week, but now we've come back down. So there's been some new economic news. The 10-year has moved down. So right now, 30-year fixed as of today, per Mortgage Daily News is 7.38 for the 30-year conventional. And then for the 30-year FHA, you're looking at 6.71. And then 30-year VA is 6.7. So we've come down so much in such a short period of time that it's really been kind of a reversal. But I think a lot of it's due to, number one, the Fed didn't raise again. And then we've had some kind of soft economic numbers kind of pointing to maybe a downturn.
Well, it'll be an interesting week next week to see if moving the rate by half a point, the Texas Rangers winning the World Series, can obviously impact the market as well, because everyone should be happy. And the weather's going to be great the next week. So those three things combined together might be for an interesting week. So we'll see how many new listings we have, and we'll kind of track how many sales took place this week.
Yeah, so there's a lot to chew. So, continue to just watch this video over and over again as you make your decision. Again, all information and decisions and conversations should be tailored to you. So our clients will be receiving that, basically having the same conversation, but about their specific information, especially as they're questioning it. But thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.